Welcome to the Clan Mackenzie podcast.
Welcome to the Clan Mackenzie podcast. This week, we have with us Scotland's Nostradamus, A Quest for the Brahan Seer's author, Andrew McKenzie, back again with us to talk about the release of the new book, which is out today, available online, wherever you can find great books. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jared. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. And it's very exciting. We're finally here. We talked about it a few months back. Your work was going to be coming out, and it is available now. You can find it on Amazon. Unicorn Publishing's put it out there. And I noticed that it's inspired others to start posting. You've seen a lot of social media posts on Facebook. People are going back and looking for stuff on the Brahan Seer, getting people really interested in this. And it's great as it ties back to your work, which is maybe the most comprehensive, maybe even the most sort of authoritative with regards to the origins of the Brahan Seer, who he was, where he's from in time. And it kind of has brought up some controversy, whether or not that's even true or not. But let's just kind of go back to how it was that you got inspired to produce this work. Because what are we talking about? Going back to the 19th century, roughly, for the last work that was put out, basically, on the Brahan Seer by Alexander Mackenzie?
Yes, although there was I think it was about 1977, Elizabeth Sutherland did an edited short book on Alexander Mackenzie. So she reprinted it in 1977 with comments and annotations. Then William Matheson, who was a folklorist in the last century, also did a commentary on it, and he was the first person to identify Coinich or as a genuine historical character who was on record in 1577 and 1578. So there have been commentaries on it since Alexander Mackenzie, but no one's really done a proper, thorough, comprehensive historical analysis of it. And it was really your podcasts, two of your podcasts last year, one with me when we discussed whether the Brahan Seer was a genuine historical character or not, and then which involved me, and then also when you were talking to Caroline Stamford about Fairburn Tower, she made the point, but she was working for the Landmark Trust, who just restored Fairburn Tower, and she commented that it was interesting why Second Sight had survived for such a long time in the Highlands, and that got me thinking this is an interesting historical subject that needs addressing. So that, alongside with the fact that I'd come across ancestors of mine, direct ancestors, my own ancestor's nephew was known to have had second sight in the mid-17th century up in Strathnarva, right at the top of Scotland. There was a story about him foreseeing someone's death. And that was quite a common trait of the way second sight was reported in that period. And it was actually the subject of the Royal Society in England. Serious early scientists were very interested in the phenomenon of second sight. So I had my own family interests. Also, Bishop Murdo was involved in witchcraft trials, and the William Matheson's Coinich, or who was tried for witchcraft, was very much part of that. So I had all of that, which I'd already knew about, but then I'd also written about him in my university dissertation on the last Lord Seaforth, because Seaforth's doom, which is probably the most famous prophecy of the Brahan Seer, which was that the Lord Seaforth would die deaf and dumb, and his 5 sons would predecease him, and his daughter would be the white-hooded lassie from the east who'd kill her sister. I addressed that in my dissertation, and the interesting thing for me at that point was that Keith Thomas, who is a very eminent historian, who I was very lucky to attend a lecture of. He was actually in Oxford when I was in Cambridge, but he came across to Cambridge to give a lecture, and he did a very interesting. He wrote a very interesting article about the origins of prophecy and why prophecies came about and why they were so popular in the 16th and the 17th century. And he made the point that they tended to come about at times of huge upheaval. So the sort of wars of religion. I mean, the 17th century was a time of massive upheaval with the Civil War, religious wars, strife. And he made the point that at times like that, people were unsettled, they were uneasy, they couldn't explain what was happening, and they took reassurance by believing that they were foretold and they were inevitable, and somehow that was a sort of panacea for their pain and uncertainty. And that was very much what I found with the last Lord Seaforth. It was the Seaforth family had run that whole area of Scotland in Ross-shire and the Isle of Lewis, where they held power, and that's where the stories about the Brahan Seer were prominent. And the sudden disappearance of Lord Seaforth and of the Mackenzie landowners in that area caused enormous upheaval. So this all required some sort of explanation when people were faced with massive change. So all the Mackenzies leaving as landowners, people, mass emigration, the Highland clearances, they came up with these stories about prophecies that it was all foretold and inevitable. And that very much fitted with Keith Thomas's, what he'd written about prophecy in the 16th and the 17th century. And then tying in with all of that, what I'd noticed at the period when we were doing that podcast, when we were talking about the Brahan Seer, that came last year when there were an awful lot of historians and sociologists talking about current conspiracy theories, with particularly the COVID pandemic, when people came up with conspiracy theories about that. And that it is very much the same pattern. When people are uncertain, they panic, they feel helpless when faced with these huge upheavals which are out of their control. And that's when people come up with conspiracy theories. And to my mind, it struck me that the Brahan Seer, as well as the long-term prophecies in the 16th, 17th century, fitted that very much that same pattern. And it was very much the same with the popularity of Nostradamus coming about with times like 9/11, when people brought up Nostradamus and said it was all foretold and predicted. So
Yeah, they did.
So all of that that sort of period last year suddenly came into my mind, and I thought I could write about all of this and tie it in together and put it into a book.
Yeah, that's a fantastic sort of thesis to put forward. It doesn't probably make a lot of people happy. People that hold on to some of those stories, sometimes it might maybe upset that kind of belief system that they've already got in place.
I guess so. I mean, that was a point that the interviewer in the BBC Alba interview that I did made, that will you upset the people in the Highlands because you trace him back to Michael Scott, who's a lowlander in the 12th century. Will you upset a lot of people in the Highlands who like to think that the Brahan Seer is their own person? But actually, I don't see that. I see my book as very much a celebration of the Highlands, and although there are other elements, and I don't think he was a genuine character, I'd like to think that what my book also shows is it celebrates the richness of Highland culture and the brilliance and the imagination of the storytellers, because these stories were told by quite simple people in their ceilidh houses, repeating over the centuries the stories that mattered to them, and it shows their imagination, and it shows how cosmopolitan Highland culture was, because I talk about how it reflects the way that the Highlanders travelled in that period in the 17th and the 18th century, because they weren't cut off by any means. There were people travelled, either there were mercenaries in the 30 Years' War, there were Jacobites in the 18th century, all of whom travelled. In fact, part of the story of Seaforth's doom is about the third Earl of Seaforth being in Paris. And interestingly, some of the aspects of the stories about the Brahan Seer are also part of typical French fairy tale traditions. There are archetypes of fairy tales like the wicked stepmother, which fits the Countess of Seaforth, who condemns him to death, is very much the archetype of the wicked stepmother. And also the Brahan Seer is very much a character that fits those cosmopolitan French fairy tales, which were very fashionable in the 17th and 18th century in high society, where he's the simple country labourer who's cleverer than his landlord and challenges them and gets the better of them in the end. That's the outcome of the story, effectively. Although he's executed, he in the end he goes to heaven, whereas she supposedly goes to hell. So he gets the better of them, and I'd like to make the point that it shows the Highlands as being a very sophisticated culture, which has this extraordinary imagination, which is something to be celebrated. And I don't dismiss him as not being a Highlander at all. I think it's a way of celebrating the history of the culture and the fact that there is a lot of real history. And I think as a historian, although it's not true, I think it's more valuable than fiction because it has elements of history in it. So in the same way that ancient fairy tales, I think, are much more valuable if they're based on real history. They're more than pure fiction because they've got reality in them. And I've always found ancient stories like Arthurian legends, if they're based on real history, they have more valuable value to them. And also that I think what's really interesting to me as a historian about the prophecies of the Brahan Seer is, although you can't say he's a historical character, what the stories highlight are what mattered most to ordinary people in that period. So he talks about the Seaforth family, who would have had enormous influence in the areas as the major landowners. What happened to them mattered to ordinary people when they ceased to be the landowner. That had a big impact on ordinary people. When land changed hands, when sheep took over, when people were cleared off their lands, when they emigrated, clearly that had major importance.
Absolutely.
Things like the Battle of Culloden, which is central to one of his prophecies, these are all reflected in his prophecies. So I think what's really interesting is the stories show the things that were important to ordinary people who don't have a voice, who couldn't write, they were illiterate. So it's a way of knowing what mattered to ordinary, voiceless, illiterate people from the past. So to me, I think he may not be a historical character, but it's still enormously valuable as a piece of history.
Yeah, and I guess that's in the BBC article that was put out, you were kind of pitted against Angus MacConach again. Now we did that. We had a discussion on him in something he was talking about recently in the last podcast, about sort of the origins of the Clan Mackenzie. Now the BBC in their article were sort of setting him up to, as a historian, talk about what we do know historically about this person, Kenneth MacConach. And he refers back to a trial in 1577 of a man that was accused of witchcraft in Western Rossshire. And so in his mind, I guess that just is the Brahan Seer.
His point was that there is no historical Brahan Seer, and I agree with that. His point was that it's folklore, and folklore isn't history. But I think that there's a more nuanced point that I was making, was that it is folklore. Of course, I completely agree with him on that. I also agree that probably the name Coinach, well, clearly the name Coinach or was derived from this 16th century character. But then what I find more interesting is that there's a whole patchwork of history from different periods. And I think it goes all the way back to the 12th century with Michael Scott. But it includes the Coinach Mór or in the 16th century, but it also, to my mind, it includes Coinach Mór, who is the third Earl of Seaforth, who was Great Kenneth, who I think was conflated with Coinach Or, because obviously they both sound the same. His castle was Brahan Castle, so Coinach Or could be conflated with Coinach Mór of Brahan Castle. The Brahan could be called the Brahan Seer, who was the third Earl of Seaforth, who was the subject of one of the most famous legends about him, because he was the person whose wife condemned him to death. There's another character called John Morrison who came from the Isle of Lewis, and the Brahan Seer is meant to have come from the Isle of Lewis. He was meant to have been a tenant of the Earl of Seaforth on the Isle of Lewis, and John Morrison came from the Isle of Lewis. He was a tenant of the Earl of Seaforth, in fact the third Earl of Seaforth, so Coinach Mór again. That was something my brother Kevin pointed out, the similarity of the Coinach Mór and Coinach Or. So John Morrison was a tenant of the Earl of Seaforth on the Isle of Lewis. But a lot of the stories about him are that he was a rather clever labourer who was witty and got the better of people. So it's a very similar story to the stories that are told about the Brahan Seer. So I think they were then attached to stories about Michael Scott, who was also meant to be very clever and witty and got the better of people, and Coinach Or, the 16th century witch that was burnt, then Coinach More, the Earl of Seaforth in the 17th century, and then John Morrison, who was his tenant. But then he had a son who was also called John Morrison, who's known as the Petty Seer, on the other side of the Murray Firth, from Shannonry. And a lot of the same stories were told about him. And he was also meant to have predicted a number of the stories, including the Battle of Culloden, the Highland clearances, and the sheep replacing the arable land, and sheep will eat men. The same stories were told about him. So I think all these stories, because they were oral traditions,
Right.
so over time, rather like Chinese whispers, they all got conflated, mixed up with each other. And then by the time Alexander Mackenzie was writing in the 19th century, he was talking to various people, and they all got mixed into one story, which he wrote down, which wouldn't necessarily have been one story that everyone told. There would have been various versions of people telling the same sort of theme, but a different version of various stories, all about someone that they called the Brahan Seer.
Yeah, what year again was his work?
That was, well, it was published in 1870. But there was also Hugh Miller had written slightly earlier than him. He'd written an earlier version, which was very slightly different, but very, very similar. That, I think that went back to about 1852, was probably the first really sort of written version of what we now consider the Brahan Seer. Although again, going back to the 18th century, Thomas Pennant mentions Coinach Or as a seer. Doesn't really say any more than that, but just says the best known of the Highland seers was Coinach Or. That's in the middle of the 18th century. So there was a seer known as Coinach Or even at that time. But the first time he was known as the Brahan Seer was with Hugh Miller, and then Alexander Mackenzie later on in the 19th century wrote more extensively and listed his predictions more extensively.
Got it. So in your research, as you're kind of compiling all this stuff, you had to go back and learn the sort of ancient Scots Gaelic to be able to read your research material to put forth this book.
There are no, I mean, there are no recordings from that period, obviously. When Alexander Mackenzie was obviously interviewing people effectively who were speaking Gaelic, but he was writing it all down in English. So as far as I'm aware, there are no written sources in Gaelic. So it wouldn't really be useful to know Gaelic in order to translate those stories. I've got a sort of basic inkling of Gaelic from having done evening classes and having a decent dictionary, and these days with Google Translate, it's not really rocket science to translate Gaelic, but it's not actually necessary for the purposes of writing about the Brahan Seer, to be honest.
Yeah. Alexander Mackenzie kind of helped us all out with that, didn't he? With his English writing of the book. So
Yeah.
super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I've never seen any Gallic accounts of the Brahan Seer that might be relevant.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a few times, and we don't want to get too much into the details of the book, but you've mentioned a few times the name Michael Scott, and that's who is on the cover of this book, of your Scotland's Nostradamus book.
Yeah, I thought what was interesting to me was that there are in fact there are two elements that are relevant to him that to my mind show that he was probably the original person that the stories got attached to over the centuries. He was a very, very well known. He's not a household name today, but in Scotland in the 15th, 16th century, he would have been a household name. Even in the whole of Europe at that time, he would have been a household name. Even Dante mentions him. He's referred to as someone who was condemned to one of the rings of hell in Dante. So he was very well known across Europe. And there are, particularly to Chanonry Point, he's related because he's meant to have employed the fairies who used to help him. And he had no work for them at one point, according to one story, and so he employed them by getting them to build a causeway from Chanonry Point to Seer, and just to get them working so that they didn't walk off and work for someone else. And halfway through, he got up one morning and realized they were just about to finish the causeway, and he was sort of put into a panic and stopped them because this would have blocked off the Murray Firth, which was an important fishing route and would have caused huge havoc to all the fishermen, which, funny enough, was particularly interesting to me because my ancestors in the 17th century owned the fishing rights to Chanonry Point. They owned land in Rosemarkie, and they owned the fishing there. And later on in my family, they were on the other side of they were in Fisherton, on the other side of the Murray Firth, and they fished there. So to me, that the sort of story about the importance of fishing in Chanonry Point really rang true. So
Yeah.
it was something that I could understand why that meant something to people in the local area, to ordinary people who were fishermen who would have told stories orally in that area. I could understand why that mattered to them. So I found that particularly interesting. But
Yes.
obviously the Chanonry Point relates to where he was burnt on a barrel of tar, according to the latest story.
Right.
But also, perhaps more significantly about Michael Scott, was that one of the stories about him was told that when he died, it was said that he predicted that if a white dove and a black raven would fly over his grave, and if the white dove got there first, he'd go to heaven, and if a raven got there first, he'd go to hell. And according to the story, the raven got there. Sorry, the dove got there first, so he went to heaven in the end. And of course, when the Brahan Seer was supposedly condemned to death by Isabel, the Countess of Seaforth, he predicted to her that if a white dove flew over his grave first, then he'd go to heaven, and he did. But she, of course, he predicted that she'd go to hell. And it's slightly ironic that Dante talks about him being in hell, when according to that legend, of course, he would have gone to heaven. But that's just an interesting
It
side point.
is, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting connection there, isn't it? I mean, it's almost taken
But
directly from the story.
I think those would have been stories that were well known by the 16th century, that were told about him. And then, of course, in the 16th century, people would have been telling stories about Coinich Or, who was burnt as a witch at Shannonry Point. And again, in this sort of Chinese whispers type fashion, they would have muddled the stories and interlinked them with the stories about Michael Scott. And then by the 17th century, that would have been interlinked with the stories about the Earl of Seaforth and the Countess of Seaforth, the Countess of Seaforth was a really strong character who was very unpopular. There are interesting historical sources which show how unpopular she was. So it's understandable how her name got blackened. And of course, there's a lot of misogyny attached there, because when her husband was abroad, she was effectively in control of the estate, and in fact, she had a massive antagonism with her daughter-in-law, the Frances, Countess of Seaforth, who was in charge when her son was in Paris, which again, interestingly, connects with the idea of Isabel's husband being in Paris in the story of the Brahan Seer. And right. I think people didn't like the idea of a woman being in charge at that time, and especially a woman with a strong character. So all this sort of stuff would have been linked with the sort of misogyny you get in fairy tales, and all this sort of, to my mind, got woven into stories by people who would have each highlighted what was important to them at the time.
Now, in your book, do you touch on any kind of historical evidence with regards to the situation that was sort of happening there with Isabel, with where her husband was and sort of what led up to the actual destruction of the Brahan Seer? Is there any historical evidence at all that something was happening at that period of time, or is there just nothing?
There's absolutely none connected with witchcraft, because my ancestor Murdo Mackenzie, who was Bishop of Murray at that precise time, and was very much part of the circle of Isabel, Countess Isabel, and all the leading Mackenzie lairds of that period. He was a major player in terms of the witchcraft trials, and he was also close to Sir George Mackenzie of Rosoch, who was a major player in witchcraft trials. In fact, although they both believed in witches, what they were skeptical about was the evidence of witches, and the way it was got out of them by torture. And so they actually helped do away with the unfair, ridiculously cruel torturing and killing of witches who clearly weren't.
Right.
And it's quite well documented. There are diaries by people like Alexander Brodie of Brodie, who was a close friend of Bishop Murdo and very much part of the circle of Countess Isabel. He talks about Countess Isabel. In fact, he dislikes her. There's Fraser, the Reverend James Fraser of Wardlaw, writes extensively about Countess Isabel. He also writes about witchcraft trials. He's very much part of that same circle. I think if the Brahan Seer had existed as he did in the story, there's no way that he wouldn't have been mentioned by these people in their
Yeah,
diaries.
absolutely.
So I think I can confidently say that the Brahan Seer, as described in Alexander Mackenzie's and Hugh Miller's books as this sort of labourer working for the early Seaforth, I'm sure that he didn't exist as a historical character in
Right.
that way.
Right. So the book, A Quest for the Brahan Seer, is really an origin story.
Yes, it's a way of putting together what I think is it's like a sort of kaleidoscope of different fragments which are all pieced together, and I reconstruct the various elements that over the course of the centuries ultimately made up the story by the time it got to the 19th century.
That's fantastic. So it's coming out today, and it is available in anywhere you can find it online. Look it up. You could go to clanmackenzie.org. We have links there for people to be able to find it. Did you have anything else you'd like to share with regards to this book to get people to think about as they consider this?
Not really. Other than I welcome any new ideas, and I mean, one point I make is that the stories about the Brahan Seer have all developed over time. So by the 20th century, they got to include the Second World War, and funny enough, there's one theory that when the Eagle Stone outside Strathpeffer falls, then the Murray Firth will flood up to Strathpeffer, and Castle Loud the grounds were flooded last October.
Oh.
And it was almost flooded right up to the Eagle Stone and Strathpeffer. And with climate change, I predict stories will be told about the Brahan Seer predicting climate change. And so I welcome any new ideas and new theories, because I think his name will be mentioned as time goes on. There'll always be room for new theories, new prophecies, what I might call a conspiracy theory relating to the Brahan Seer in the future.
Scotland's Nostradamus, A Quest for the Brahan Seer. Andrew McKenzie, thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to reading the book.
Thank you, Jared.
Thank you for listening to the Clan Mackenzie podcast. To explore more about our history, heritage and ongoing work, visit clanmackenzie.org. Be sure to follow, share and leave a review. Your support helps us continue defending the future by understanding the past.